Not ignore that, and then what it means for me is actually how it tees up into Alex's talk following mine. So insecticide development. In the 1940s and the 1950s, we started to create these chlorinated hydrocarbons. Does anybody remember DDT? Remember chlordane, yeah. Right? And dieldrin. If you read Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, which I did recently to refresh my memory, she refers to all three of these chemistries in her book. And they had very broad sweeping, off-target activities that were ultimately and accidentally unwarranted and unwanted, right? So we had a lot of downstream impacts from those insecticide classes. They did their jobs, but we didn't know what their total ecological impact was going to be at the time. So she started a new movement to move towards more softer chemistries, and as you progress on the timeline to the right, you see that there's a strategic development of less toxic materials from one generation on to the next. So the next generation was the organophosphates and carbamates. Organophosphates, remember lorsban, that we really don't have a whole lot of access to anymore in limited uses. Dimethoate fit into that category, diazinon as well. Organophosphates and carbamates also were deemed to have some off-target issues that we weren't aware of at the time of development in the 60s and 70s. Now, what's not on this timeline is one of the really important benchmarks. Because of the environmental work that was being done in the 1960s, and us launching ourselves up to the moon and seeing that we have finite resources on this little marble that we're on, the 1970, under Nixon's guidance, the US EPA was established. So then we started having Environmental Protection Agency looking over any new chemistries that are coming into market, and then birthed the next section of pyrethroids. So pyrethroids, can somebody tell me where they come from? Right, so we have nature-inspired chemistries in the pyrethroids. Lambda-cyhalothrin is one of those, beta-cyfluthrin, permethrin are all members of that class of chemistries. And then we have this whole new wave starting in the 1990s of what we call the reduced risk insecticides. And those include the classic chemistries we'll talk mostly about today, which are the neonicotinoids in the green. And then we'll also talk, I'm not going to talk today or cover on the insect growth regulators. All right, emergence of neonicotinoids. They came in the 1990s. They really were designed to pattern after nicotine, and they were deemed, okay, we've got organophosphates and carbamates we're trying to phase out. They are pretty widely used at the time of the development. And the neonicotinoids early on promised to be much lower risk for non-target organisms. So this is a good movement forward with insecticide development. But the other thing too, we've got high target specificity to insects. And I'll show you that in some of the toxicology work, is that mammalian toxicity is very low. So how do they work? All right, this is a mouthful. So we'll go through this in several building slides. The mode of action is actually acetylcholine reception inhibition. So if you have a typical transmitting neuron and a recepting neuron, so you're talking about central nervous system here, and the little blobs in the center here is your acetylcholine. And then you have acetylcholine esterase that takes the enzyme and splits it into acetyl and choline, and that's what those little small dots are in the middle. Right, let me use, there, right here. So we've got acetylcholine being split into acetyl and choline, and within this, sorry, here we go. These guys, this is where the binder sites are, but acetylcholine is released by the synaptic vesicles. It's used by acetylcholine esterase and allows for ion transfer over to the recepting neuron. So So what happens is the acetylcholine then is broken into two pieces, and this is where the ion transfer begins and can go from a transmitting neuron to the receptor neuron, and it's all because of this acetylcholinesterase enzyme. What happens when you introduce an acetylcholinesterase or acetylcholine inhibitor is you've got these little pink blockages here, and the acetylcholinesterase cannot do its job. So what happens with a neonicotinoid insecticide is that all of a sudden acetylcholinesterase is no longer able to break down acetylcholine and transfer it from a transmitting neuron and a recepting neuron. And so that leads to paralysis in insects. It leads to overstimulation of other parts of the central nervous system, and the central nervous system for insects is particularly sensitive to this type of blockage. All right, everybody good on chemistry so far? Okay. Now, the chemical structures that are important here, we say, okay, well, what does nicotine have to do with this, and what are the neonicotinoids, and how do they react with nicotine? Acetylcholine has this nitrogen compound out here, where on the right side you see a pyrrolidine. On the pyrrolidine, you see that there's kind of a hydrogen and a nitrogen. The nitrogen is what's actually binding in the same site that the acetylcholine would in the acetylcholinesterase. So, really important to have that nitrogen. So what do you see here? On nicotine is on the left-hand side, and you see that 5-membered ring on the right-hand side with the nitrogen on it. That's the activity point right here, where the laser is. And what's similar to imidacloprid and the neonicotinoids is the same. See, the nitrogen on the 5-membered ring is really important. And that's because it's basically that functional spot that binds into acetylcholinesterase. All right. Now, within the group 4 insecticides, I can't talk about the neonicotinoids without talking about there are other classes that also inhibit the acetylcholine receptor points. So group 4A, the neonicotinoids, are on the left-hand side for you. Nicotine is in its own class as a 4B. It's actually classified as an insecticide. Sulfoxamines is group 4C. The butynylides, 4D, and then others down at the bottom corner that we don't have access to here in California. So they all have similar structures that can bind at the acetylcholinesterase binding site and block that neurotransmission. Now, of course, Alex is going to cover this in more depth, but there are 4 active ingredients, and I know it's very difficult to read with the projector today, but if you need me to tell you what anything says, please let me know. Dinotefuran, clothianidin, imidacloprid, and thiamethoxam are all part of the January 1 new regulations on the neonicotinoids. I will talk a little bit more about how that came about from a historical standpoint, and then Alex is going to cover, what the most important pieces are for you to understand on the new regulations, but wanted just to point those 4 out. Those 4 class of chemistries fall all within the neonicotinoid class. So not all group 4 insecticides are going to be part of that new regulation, and I think that's important to pay attention to. There's also an interesting omission within that is that acid-amiprid or acale is also not part of that, and it's the only 4A chemistry where we have registrations in California that is not under that new guideline for CDPR, excuse me. So then we have sulfoxamines, newer chemistry, Sequoia and Savanto, and butynylides. They fall under classes of their own. Those are the 2 others that we have registration in California with that block that same receptor site. All right, so now's the chemistry lesson. We're going to talk first on relative toxicity. Then I want to tell you a little bit about solubility and adsorption, or soil adherence, because that's really important for choosing the right materials for your own purposes. So mammalian toxicity. Remember at the beginning, I talked about the timeline, and progressively over the years, we've gone from toxic insecticides that had a lot of off-target accidental issues through things that now are much softer chemistries. Well, have you ever seen something where you can plot it all out? If we're just going back, I don't want to put DDT or dieldrin on here. We've already seen enough of that in years past. But an organophosphate on here, that's lambda-cyhalothrin and one other, and then a pyrethroid. Pyrethroid is lambda-cyhalothrin, the organophosphate on here is lorsban. So clopyrifos, all the way to the left, that means the lower amount of product, or the lower amount of active ingredient per kilogram that it takes is the higher toxicity. So that's why that's colored red on the left-hand side. The more and more you can ingest without having a lethal dose is found to the right of this chart. And to give you some perspective, 5,000, which is all the way over here on the right, that for a neonicotinoid where it would take 5,000 milligrams per kilogram, that would be like eating a sheet of paper, the weight of a sheet of paper per kilogram of your body weight. So let's put this into perspective. How many people in here weigh roughly around 150 pounds? You would have to eat the weight of 70 sheets of paper of active ingredient for that to be toxic to you. So that's kind of how you put this into perspective. Another way to put it into perspective is say, okay, baking soda. If I fed a rat baking soda and if I fed a rat table salt, how much baking soda, how much table salt could they ingest before it becomes toxic? And so you can see that the LD50, this is only 50% of the population that it becomes toxic to. And so there's a huge range of toxicity with all the nicotinic acetylcholine receptor inhibitors. And you can also see the sulfoxamine, which is the 4C, is right above baking soda. I know that the color is hard to distinguish there, but in table salt's still less toxic than the butanolide, which is Savanto. But sort of interesting to put that into perspective, isn't it? All right, now aquatic toxicology. It's required for all product development to go through different types of toxicological work. One of the other things they do is they look at aquatic toxicology. This is under the ecotox portion of the product development cycles. And they use trout typically as an example of how toxic it could be to fish. And you see a pretty wide range here. A lot of times they don't test above 100 milligrams per liter for 96 hours because most of the products are never going to be used in that concentration. And so that 100 level there is considered practically non-toxic. But there are some people that take it even further and show exactly how non-toxic they could be and actually get the exact numbers. So you can see it stretches all the way to 1,000 milligrams per liter for a 96-hour of exposure to the trout. Again, let's use our favorites, table salt and baking soda. They're pretty non-toxic to fish overall if you dissolve the water and put them in it. I don't think they would like it or be able to breathe very well, but there's your comparison chart. Now, Daphnia. Anybody know what Daphnia are? They're a water flea, but they're used as a surrogate for any aquatic invertebrates. And the aquatic invertebrates also, huge range of scale as far as toxicology goes with the neonicotinoids and the nicotine acetylcholine receptor inhibitors, all the way up to 1,230 milligrams per liter, and this is only a 48-hour window test on these teeny little water fleas. So still making a huge stepwise change over the organophosphates and the pyrethroids. And if I stretch that out, you'd see that it's 0.000 something. It's almost zero that you can expose Daphnia to when it comes to organophosphates and pyrethroids. There's our baking soda and table salt for your knowledge. So it's actually interesting that the butanolide, which is Savanto, falls between baking soda and table salt as far as non-toxic to aquatic invertebrates. Kind of interesting, isn't it? Do we think about this? Okay, so for an application standpoint, a couple more pieces of chemistry and then we'll move into other topics. But on the chemistry side, these products, the neonicotinoids, are used both foliarly and soil applied. You probably all use them. How many people in the room have used a neonicotinoid in some capacity? Okay, almost everyone. So how much do you know about water solubility of the different neonicotinoids? What about soil adherence? Okay, so we'll take that into the next slide. Water solubility, huge range. What does this mean as far as water solubility? It means that the active ingredient can dissolve in a liter of water. So picture a little, beaker of water, and you've got anything from the pyrethroids and organophosphates that are practically, you can't really dissolve them in water. They're dissolvable in like an EC formulation or petroleum distillates, but they don't dissolve well in water. So anywhere from the left-hand side where you've got about, let's say 400 milligrams per liter, so 400 milligrams per liter, all the way over to 5,000. And remember, 5,000 is that benchmark of the weight of a sheet of paper. So 5,000 milligrams in a liter of water, you've got the weight of a sheet of paper in a liter of water, and it ranges all the way up to 39,000. Does anybody know what neonicotinoid is 39,830 milligrams that you can dissolve in a little container.
Yeah.
It is. Who said that? Okay, I heard venom. Anyway, excellent, because yes, dinotefuran, or venom, is the most highly soluble neonicotinoid that we have access to in California. So, awesome job. I have a pencil for you if you want it. I am not kidding. It's pretty sharp at the end. There you go. Somebody want to pass that back to him? You're sharp. So, all right. So, what's really important here is that if you can fit a lot of active ingredient in a little bit of water, think about the transpiration stream inside of the plant. How well is it going to move in the plant if you can't really fit any of the active ingredient in the transpiration stream? Is it going to move with the water? No. So if you can dissolve a fair amount, like you've got, let's see here, thiamethoxam or platinum is at 4,100 milligrams per liter. And then again, Savanto's there around like 3,200. If you have high solubility, you can have high mobility in a plant. But if you have as much mobility as venom, what else is an issue sometimes?
Leaching.
Leaching, exactly. Okay, he was pencil too. All right, so leaching can be a problem, so you have to watch that because it's also important. Go pass that on back. Also important to pay attention to not having leaching problems with these. So you want a balance between water solubility and how well it adheres to the soil. So the water solubility piece, we understand there's a huge range. I have the tables for these if you're curious, and I would be glad to give them to Sandy to pass out to everyone. But they're kind of a mess. There's a geeky scientist style that I put together so far. But I can gladly give you what's what on this chart if you need it. Soil adsorption. The other thing that's really important for the balance of how we apply these materials is how well do they apply to, or how well do they stick to the soil? Do you want to apply something that sticks to the soil so heavily that it's never going to come off of the soil? You see way over on the far right, those high numbers? The organophosphates and pyrethroids are not applied via soil. Why? Because they bind. They bind really tightly and they don't want to let go. Everything way over to the left is something that will loosen off of the soil and actually could move up through the plant. And so you want something kind of in between, or that has some flexibility depending on soil type. You can see there's a couple of these that have bars across them. That means that depending on soil conditions and soil types and what the ionic structures are, basically you've got a range. And it's nice when you have chemical safety data sheets that give you the whole range. And that's what these were built off of. So anyway, another soil adsorption. You want something that has reasonable soil adsorption, so it stays in the soil, doesn't wash down, but doesn't bind so tightly that the plant can't take it up through the transpiration stream. So think about that. And sometimes I know the labels are very important and labels are really, really helpful when you're choosing your products, but this is how SDS sheets can also be helpful, because you're looking at extra pieces of the chemistry that can tell you how best to place the right products. For example, imidacloprid, where this really plays in, imidacloprid isn't as soluble as some of the other neonicotinoids. And so what do you do with that? When you put it on the soil application, you drive water. You put water out first, you drive a lot of water with an application, and then you drive water after imidacloprid if you want it in the plant quickly. Am I right? Okay. Anybody do it any other way? Okay. I'm glad that I'm still on top of it. So, soil adsorption. Any questions on the chemical properties that can be useful to you and the relative toxicities before I move into some other pieces of topics? All right. So moving on, just for anybody that's not as familiar with the neonicotinoids, they have a really wide range of insects that they target. And they can be anything from phylloxera to leafhoppers to mealybugs, sharpshooters, aphids and apples, grape leaf skeletonizers, stink bugs, and scale. So a lot of insects are very, very sensitive to the neonicotinoid insecticides. Other thing, I'm not going to forget the pink elephant in the room. Honeybees are a really big topic, and it's one of the drivers behind the new CDPR regulations. But I'd like to talk about why are they in the news so much from a more historical perspective. So where did it start? Okay, 2008 is pretty much when it started for us. In 2008, there was an adverse effects report that went into CDPR here in California, and they were forced to take action. So they said, okay, looks like imidacloprid has a potential of harming pollinators, namely honeybees. So we're going to reevaluate not just imidacloprid, but thiamethoxam, dinotefuran, and clothianidin. And so that's Venom, Belay, Platinum, Admire for the main brands that I can recollect. What they did in 2009 is they started off what has become the regulations he'll talk about that started in January 1st of 2024. So think about the timeline behind that. This takes a lot of time to go through all of the science that they've done. Now, at the same time, what else was the world dealing with? Colony collapse disorder. So everybody's looking for something to point a finger at or an explanation why. And I actually had the ability to be at the USDA over in Baltimore for a conversation where we talked through the different potential causations of the colony collapse disorder sources, and they called out specifically not any other class of chemistries, but what? The neonicotinoids. So we've got one of the top goals, goal number 1 on this topic number 3 of colony collapse disorder was, are the neonicotinoids pesticides part of the colony collapse disorder problem? And people were just starting to understand that the varroa mite had anything to do with it, and that there were diseases that hives could get, and people weren't even really thinking about proper nutrition. I remember sitting in the room, and there were 2 very large beekeepers from across the United States. One of them was saying, I had a 95% collapse. The other one on the other side of the room says, oh, that's because you don't take care of them. And they were fighting over everything. And I'm thinking, these guys are the experts. They know how to take care of their bees. So we really didn't know what we were doing. But colony collapse disorder just happened to be at the same time that the neonics became part of the conversation. And then we have 5 pages of of 2 research studies that were published in Science in 2012. So advance a couple years later. And I have links, by the way, to all of these resources if you like. A 3-page publication and a 2-page publication in Science. And what did they summarize between the 2 of them? Bad news for bees. Oh, we now have global attention on neonicotinoids and the potential of toxicity to bees. But it didn't stop there. So we've got, in 2013, a congressman out of Oregon actually grabbed hold of some of this news and the information that was emerging and created a 1-pager that ended up becoming the Save America's Pollinator Act of not 2013, like his original 1-pager, but of 2021 by the time he got in front of Congress. And so Bill 4079, introduced to the House in June of 2021, had some pretty profound statements in it, and I've pulled some of those comments out of it. First, it required that the EPA establish a pollinator protection board. Cool, I like that idea. I'm happy with that. Are you? Yeah. It was specific, again, to the neonicotinoid insecticides. I'm not sure why we're excluding some of the other classes of chemistries that are available for use or are widespread use across the rest of the United States. But he claimed too, he says, okay, what we have to do with this act is we have to stop immediately and permanently cancel all neonicotinoid insecticides. And we need to revoke their food tolerances and discontinue all sales. Remember how close the chemistries looked between nicotine? Did anybody smoke when they were younger or try it once? Okay, let's see here. So we've got revoke the food tolerances and discontinue all sales. So if you've ever encountered a tobacco product, you are now no longer exempt. And prevent the use of stock was the one that really shocked me, because preventing the use of stock means that if you've purchased it for next year's applications, he didn't want you to use it. Forget it, you're just out. You're out all the investment that you put in place. That is a big problem. And how many times has that happened where we've changed regulations and we still have to go through stock? Or you find something in the barn a couple years later, you ask your retailer and say, can I still use this? And they're like, yes, there are exemptions in place and you can. He said emergency exceptions should only be okay if they're warranted by the board, but there were no guidelines on what warranted meant. So the Save the America's Pollinator Act went into publication, and anybody in the United States can read these documents. So we now have public information that calls out neonicotinoids, toxicity to bees, and really, really strong action to be taken against them. Thankfully for us, because these are pretty extreme measures that would really rock our worlds as far as agriculturalists, It went into a subcommittee in 2021, and there's been no further action on this particular bill. But it's in the public sector, it's in the public eye, and it's very strong language. Now, how many people love butterflies? I'm a gardener, I love butterflies. I have something blooming in my garden 12 months out of the year, and I love pollinators. So, I mean, this would pull my heartstrings too. So, University of Nevada in Reno has this researcher named Matthew Forrester. In 2016, he's been involved in some research studies looking at the overall decline of butterfly populations across mostly Northern California. And he says, okay, we know that changes in land use and climate have negative impacts on butterflies, but what does he call out specifically in that next sentence? If, for those of you in the front that can read this. Neonicotinoids, right? And then further down in the article, if you make it that far, he also says, it should be remembered that our results, I get excited, sorry. Remember that our results are observational, they're correlative, and it's a crude spatial scale, so we can only suggest what's happening. Does that sound scientific to you? No. Okay. Although we can't establish causation, we hope that the results will inspire future experimental research with butterflies to complement similar work that's going on with honeybees. So again, are we taking the ball and continuing it down the same avalanche path? Now, let's get a little bit more modern day here. Just last year, the European Academies of Science pulled together all different associations, and where you can't read on the right-hand side, that's the list of organizations across Europe and around the globe that partnered with ESAC to evaluate 409 documents and papers, and they published their results in 2023. It was 66 pages long. They got to their conclusions about page 38, and I'll cover a couple of those conclusions. But there's things on here from Austria. The Austrian Academy of Sciences is in here, Norway, Czech Republic. I can't even read it from here, but it's all broad sweeping, and it's all these European agencies got together. So it's not just one organization at this point. They've kind of collected all of their friends to do this work. And what's really interesting reading through, they have one page of this where it's 10 conclusions. And it's extremely soft language where it's really hard to understand concretely what they learned from all of the research. So I did my best to try to pull out some of the key messages that they shared. Essentially, they associated food security as a top priority. And they said neonicotinoids are associated with the reduction in biodiversity that has led to an issue in food security. So now we're taking another leap here where we're saying neonics, we blame them for maybe down the line not having enough food. I think this is interesting to me. They also said that increased IPM increases biodiversity.
A biodiversity in the food being farmed?
Biodiversity on their scale was all ecosystem type stuff. So it's plants, animals, insects, a mix. But basically saying that the use of neonicotinoids, their conclusion was we are reducing the amount of diversity in the biota, and therefore are at a risk of losing secure food security. That was redundant. So we have an increase in IPM means to them increases in biodiversity. Okay, do you guys remember the foundation of integrative pest management? Okay, and what's one of the critical factors in integrative pest management? Thresholds. So if you have an economically damaging pest that pushes past a threshold where you can no longer farm in an economic manner, then what does that trigger?
Food insecurity.
Food insecurity. It triggers the ability to use things like pesticides after you reach an economic threshold or a pest threshold that causes economic damage. That's the premise and the principle behind integrative pest management. So I think that's kind of interesting because what the ESAC team has decided is that increased IPM means increased biodiversity. I can see where they're going with that, but they also say at the same time that reduced pesticide use means reduced risk to the environment. Okay, these are all fitting within integrative pest management, I can buy that. But one of the other things they do that I actually really agree with is the ESAC team decided that pollinators are not just bees. And we get very focused on that because we talk about honeybees a lot, But pollinators are all kinds of things. They can be small animals, they can be hummingbird moths, they can be a whole association. You've got birds and all kinds of things that can be pollinators. So I think they did right on making that assumption. The other thing that they called for is they said, okay, we need increased proof that there are no broad ecosystem impacts in the registration requirements. So what did we talk about earlier on the toxicological work? We talked about fish toxicology, we talked about aquatic invertebrate toxicology. The other thing that I didn't talk about is the process, because we don't have enough time for that, is the process of all of the registrants today with new chemistries have to go through a really stringent honeybee toxicology work. And that's adding huge and tremendous amounts of work, time, and finances to bringing new products to the market. And it makes it harder and harder for people to develop new chemistries when they have to go through some of these extra steps. So the increased proof of no broad ecosystem impacts, I think it's going to be really important to see what specifically they're looking for, because there's already a lot of ecotox work done, at least in the United States. Remember, this is Europe. Preventative treatments or seed treatments. The ESAC team decided preventative treatments, unless you can unequivocally say that you cannot grow a crop without the use of a seed treatment, we don't support it, and we don't think it's warranted. So it's not merit-worthy to use unless you can absolutely prove it. And then finally, the other thing that they called for, and I just see dollar signs flying out of this last bullet point, is they want increase in research. They didn't say who's going to pay for it. They want increase in training. They want increase in information available to the public, advice, extension, pesticide use monitoring, and then also up to financial incentives to the growers for not using pesticides. Where do you think that funding is going to come from? Because that's an awful lot of asks, in my opinion. So now we move into California again. We're going to leave Europe, come back to California, and talk a little bit about where we're at today, and then I'm going to hand it over to Alex to wrap up at the end of our session today. Does anybody have any questions or comments before I move into the timeline for where we're at here in California? Okay. So in 1994, imidacloprid was registered in the state of California. So we've been using it for quite some time before the adverse effects report that I mentioned was in 2008. That's when DPR said, okay, well, we have to act on this. It's part of our duty to the state. 2009, they established the 4 neonicotinoids that re-entered the re-evaluation. And in 2014, the Assembly Bill was adopted. 2018, they did the risk determination. And if you want to find it on DPR, this California Neonicotinoid risk determination is 1,200 pages long. It's going to put you to sleep really quickly. Regulation then opened for public comment period, not once, but twice. So I downloaded some slides from CDPR, and I had to add a bullet point here because one of the things that they omitted on this is the October 22nd, 2022 second public comment period. How many times have you seen the Department of Pesticide Regulation open up a second window for public comment? It's unusual. So this is a really big deal. And then finally, in April of 2023, all the regulations were filed. And again, Alex is going to cover what got implemented in January of this year. So let's do a quick rundown. That was a lot in a very short period of time. Thank you for bearing with me. The neonicotinoids, what were they designed for? Lower overall toxicity and selectivity for insect control, not off target. So low mammalian toxicity, right? Mode of action. They inhibit the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. Insects, basically all of that. The acetylcholine receptor bundle is all within the central nervous system in insects. That's why they're specific to insects. Generally, they have lower mammalian toxicity than the organophosphates, than the carbamates, and then some of the pyrethroids. And then they can be used in foliar or systemic use. The label directions give you a lot of guidelines to choose, but one thing that's missing is that water solubility and the soil adsorption. You have to really dig around on the internet to look for the right SDS sheets for those. I can help you find it if you like, and I'll give you my tables if you want. Pest control. It's anything like keys for us up here, mealybugs, sharpshooters, aphids in the apple industry, and more. A lot of sucking, piercing insects. And the scientific review and political spotlight, I covered it in a multitude of slides, but it's widespread, it's a hot topic, and it's really complex. So there's some great science out there on neonicotinoids, but there's also a lot of very emotional language. So I charge all of us to look through the emotional language, look at the science, and let's help make smart decisions with the neonicotinoid insecticides. So I want to quick say thank you. Our Vista Resources made it possible for me to come up here for you guys today, and my contact information is here. I am an outside contractor, and it's been just a really neat road. I've done work in a large manufacturer as a product development scientist. I've worked to actually help build a research program at an ag retailer, and to be able to be here to represent all of the walks of life I've had previously in my career is just such a treat. So thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Any questions? Question.
I'm not sure if Alex is going to talk about this, but why was the cellulose active ingredient left out of the regulations? I would think you would want to do all for AA if you're going to do this. So it seems like kind of a weird little asterisk where we're like,
right,
we can't use these certain ones multiple times past a certain point, but we'll just throw a sale out there.
So I'll give my quick take, but I actually think he's going to do a better job at getting into the details on that. But at the time when they started that, remember it goes back to 2008 and 2009, and at that period of time, the amount of use and the pounds per acre used widespread across the state was really centered around those 4 active ingredients. And so acetamiprid really wasn't a high profile, high use product at the time. That's my personal opinion. Alex, do you have anything to add to that?
You know, part of it is philosophical, just how policy is made. It's really kind of that intersection between science and what the public wants or needs at a certain time. What policy becomes is that no side is happy.
Yeah,
so,
true. Yeah.
That's kind of my philosophical take on that. Just having to decide how the regulations are.
Yeah.
So once we reach that place, then that becomes policy, right?
That becomes policy.
Yeah. How many people like compromising, really? I mean, any other questions? Question back here.
Sorry, I might have missed this. Has there been research done on the actual impact on bees of neonicotinoids?
Yes. So the question for anybody that didn't hear was, has there actually been research done on the actual toxicity of the neonicotinoids on bees? And yes, there's loads and loads and loads of it. You can find all those resources on any of these, but today I didn't cover that topic because we would be here for several hours, I think. But I would like to, maybe a good follow-up is to just send out a one-pager and say, here's a summary of what we do know. Reading through some of them, the research quality varies greatly, just like the toxicology. And it's hard to know the difference. Even for me as a scientist, it's really tough to decide the difference between, is this a valid study, or is this a valid study, or is this a valid study? And if you put a bee in a box and force feed him like a duck turning into foie gras, is that representative of what we have in agriculture? And it's hard to really understand sometimes how they've administered the pesticides when they're studying them. So it's just as complicated as the politics, honestly, the science. Yeah. I think it probably the bee studies that have to go through the EPA registration process now, as we have access to more of that data, is far more standardized. And I think that would be worth mining at some point in time. Question?
I remember from the mid-2000s, one anecdotal case that I think really captured the headlines and tied it to the CCD. And it had to do with equipment that was putting out treated seeds.
Oh.
And then when they would get to the headlands, the fan would be coated in the coating, and they would clean it. And then there was this mass die-off of like several 100,000 bees, all in this one area. And they just assumed it meant using these things.
Yeah.
It's because there was a high concentration of the seed stuff being cleaned onto these weeds in the headlands.
Yeah,
So
I think
that might tie it all together.
Yeah, I think I remember that scenario coming up in several of the documentation that I was reading through, and I think I remember that situation too. I was in graduate school at the time, but at Midwest, and any edges of fields were a big issue for applications too. So I think, we've learned a lot about applications even, and we've learned a lot about pesticide drift even since then. and we do a lot more soil applications today. But yeah, seed coatings in particular have taken a major hit on the focus on neonicotinoids, and it's probably for that reason. Yeah. All right. Thank you. Alex, take it away.
Give Josie another hand. That was an excellent talk, giving a lot of context.
And the resources are here. I've only got 20 pages of them though. So.
That was an excellent talk, giving a lot of context to where nicotinoids were and kind of where they're going, the science of them. Yeah, certainly everyone in here has experience with neonicotinoids, either in the production ag work that you do or in your personal lives. Neonicotinoids are flea and tick medication, right, for dogs and cats. So I'm sure everyone in here has some sort of experience in that. So like Josie said and Jason, I'm here from the Agricultural Commissioner's Office to provide some insight into how what these regulations mean. There's going to be a lot of, at the Q&A part, there's going to be a lot of very individual scenarios that I may not be able to answer without really sitting down and kind of dissecting through how we're using these, what materials you're using, what labels you're using. So we're really going over the regulation at face value. I know this is being recorded for our virtual audience there and for audiences here. It's not legal information. I'm not giving you illegal advice, but really just walk through here. So there may be pitfalls in my presentation, but you can always rely on reading the code, right? Reading the regulations itself, emailing the local ag commissioner's office, or emailing the state at DPR. So those are kind of the disclaimers I want to put out there before jumping into this presentation. By this time of the year, I've given this presentation several times already. And the regulations are confusing. I'm not going to lie, they are confusing. I did get it wrong, misinterpreted a few bits of language at first, but so I'm right there with you if some of this stuff may be a bit hard to follow. But the more I give this presentation and the more I receive Q&A on neonicotinoids, I do see that there is a better understanding of it out there slowly, and at the end of the presentation, I'm pretty sure that you'll walk away realizing that this may not actually affect your day-to-day operations and your planning. But so we'll just dive right in. I know Josie gave an incredible history of neonicotinoids. Essentially, basically in 2014, Assembly Bill AB 1789 passed, which was adopted to law into the Food and Ag Code as Section 12838, which ordered DPR to reevaluate neonicotinoids and take action to mitigate its impacts to the environment, to people, to food crops, pollinators. Later in 2018, the risk determination was passed, and as Josie said, it was a 1,200-page document that you can read still to this day, go through different studies, go through the different materials, methods, and kind of the logic of why things are headed the way they are. And essentially, residues in pollen and nectar, neonicotinoid residues in pollen and nectar affect pollinators and their health. The resulting of all this is the adoption of regulations, 3 CCR, that's Title 3 of the California Code of Regulations, Section 6990, all the way through 6990.16. Right, that's broken down by commodity grouping. So just to recap, the purpose of these regulations are to protect pollinators, not just for the not just to protect them, but to protect them because pollinators are of interest to producers, agricultural producers, and those that consume agricultural products. So DPR has developed these regulations to try to best fit a crop's specific attractiveness to pollinators. It's not perfect, it's not broad sweeping, one size fits all regulation, so that's why you got to jump around the different sections a bit. But it's really evaluated on how attractive a particular crop is to bees and how bees are used in growing the crop, right? So pesticide labels won't be actually updated with these regulations, with these changes. Remember, these are California regulations. Pesticide labels are regulated at the EPA levels, so in the future, we may see some changes reflected there, but these regulations we're talking about today are California specific that protect pollinators here in our industry. We do see that when we do understand that California tends to be kind of a driver of some of these regulations, so it's likely that these will get passed on through label changes down the road, but right now there are no huge significant label changes that you can easily follow to be in compliance with California regulations. So that's one pitfall right there, right? Just being able to reference the regulation on top of referencing the pesticide label. Like we mentioned a few times now, only these 4 active ingredients will be impacted with these regulations, right? There are other pesticides, other neonics that act on the same receptor, have the same mode of action that are not addressed in these regulations whatsoever. The regulations only address these 4. So if you're not using any products with these 4 actives, with either of these 4 actives, I know some are combination materials, then the regulations don't apply to you, right? So that's kind of that easy sort of easy way sort of thing to deal with to see if these regulations apply at all. So the exemptions that are built into these regulations are basically if you're growing a commodity that's excluded from pollinators, either through netting, through a structure, somehow. If pollinators can't access your commodity to pollinate, then these regulations don't apply to you, okay? Not sure if any one of you grows grapes. Am I okay to assume that most people in here are grape growers? Okay. Not sure if anyone has adopted insect exclusionary netting to growing grapes. I don't know if you want to in the future, but adopting something like that immediately exempts you from these regulations. And then, of course, you get the other ones if you are using a neonic, one of these 4 neonics to address the local pest emergency, right, a quarantine pest, and that would be a declared emergency, declared issue by CDFA or our office. Section 18 emergency exemption to use it, or a research authorization issued by DPR, primarily to support the research in shaping these regulations for the future. So those are the exemptions there. And we'll get a bit into how grapes have a built-in exemption that's not as obvious. So each of you should have a handout right now. Let's reference that. Let's pull that handout out. It's actually very well written, and I think Misty's going around. If folks don't have a handout, I think we can read that. So this handout's really your one-stop shop to navigate these regulations. Again, these regulations are written based on crop groupings that you all should be aware of already, based on reading labels, going through PCA school, QAL school. So they're universal kind of federal crop groupings. That's how the regulations are built. Again, they're based off of how attractive a plant is to bees and other pollinators, and how pollinators are used in the farming of the commodity. Regardless of whatever commodity you use, there are going to be one or more types of restrictions placed on neonicotinoid use. Grapes, which we'll go into real quick, are actually on the lower side, lower end of restrictions. So let's just go in here. There's gonna be a front page. What I'm looking at here is a table on the back page of that. Let's flip to the back page of that handout real quick, where you should see a table and a brown box, a gray box. Let's ignore that table at the bottom for now. I know that table, tables are really easy to read. We'd love to jump right to them. Let's ignore that for now, and let's just go through these 4 points. So these are the restrictions that apply to commodities in the small berries and small fruit crop category, okay, which grapes are in. So 1, there's a bloom prohibition. So whenever there's flowers in bloom, neonicotinoids are restricted from use, either foliar or soil applications. Yes, Cindy?
Now, is that flowers in the crop itself, or what about ground cover flowers?
We'll get into that. We'll get into that. So bloom prohibition is that when flowers are in bloom in the crop, and we'll get into kind of where we're leading with that question, neonics are prohibited. Okay, so that's 1. Second is the actual rate cap. Okay, the second restriction is basically addressing a situation where you're using more than 1 neonic active ingredient or more than 1 application method in a growing season. Okay, if you're doing that, if you're mixing and matching, then there's a cap. There's a maximum that you can use either way. We'll jump right into that in a moment. 3 doesn't apply to you because it says except grapes. And 4, if managed pollinators will be used to pollinate grapes during the growing season, then we reference the table below. Now, does any one of you use managed pollinators as part of your grape growing operation? Great. But managed pollinators is very much defined. Means that bees that are introduced to a field to provide pollination services, that's 1, so you have bees that are providing some sort of pollination services to your grapes. 2, to the crops in the field, to the crops, right, to whatever you're producing, and of course in the field, right, so it needs to be integral to how you're growing this commodity. Yes, we had a question.
Yeah, so that doesn't apply to like, 'cause I know at our vineyards we have probably several hundred bee boxes from the company, but we don't use them for agricultural purposes. They're just there.
Will not apply. Will not apply. And from an enforcement side of things, right, DPR and Ag Commissioner's Office would have to prove one way or another that those bees are being used to pollinate that crop. Okay? So if your operations don't look like this, which we find throughout the Central Valley with almond bloom right now, that table doesn't apply to you in the restrictions. So really, we're stuck with these 2 restrictions, right? Bloom prohibition and a combined application rate kind of cap. Does anyone have any questions about that second point, about mixing and matching methods, mixing and matching active ingredients? I know I've given a few talks already, and when we focus on this point a bit, I think many folks realize that their operations right now, they don't use more than 1 active ingredient, neonic active ingredient, or they don't use more than 1 method. So for most here, I don't think it should affect how you're doing things. We had a quick question?
Yeah, I've seen a couple messages come out from like other counties in clarifying this a little bit more. So would you say that we're in line? I saw something from Santa Barbara County talking about if you're just doing like a soil application, the max rate wouldn't necessarily change to the new.
Exactly. That's another way of looking at it.
Yeah.
Another way of looking at it is that if you're using 1 active ingredient or 1 method, you can go as far as the label will allow you to. Okay? So that's kind of that other side of the coin sort of thing. Again, we're starting to see that labels are changing, right? Labels may be already this restrictive, but the regulations allow you to go at the label rate if you're using 1 active ingredient or 1 method. Now, if so this may affect you in planning your pesticide applications or your neonic applications for the season. but it does not affect you if you already know what you're going to do. So if you anticipate that you may have to switch up a method or switch up an active ingredient, then these caps are very important, because if you max out a labeled rate, it may eliminate the option for you to switch out to that second active ingredient or second method, right? Because the combined rate needs to only be 0.3 pounds of AI an acre right there. So, and bloom means the period of from the onset of flowering until petal falls complete. So that's how you assess whether your grapes are in bloom or not, according to this regulation. Protection of bees. So what Cindy asked, does this apply to other crops in your vineyard, other weed crops, other ornamental crops in your vineyard that may be in bloom and may be visited by pollinators? It does not. These regulations apply only to the application of neonicotinoids to the agricultural product you're producing, okay? Existing regulations concerning protection of bees are still in play. They don't interact with each other. Existing regulations require that beekeepers in the area, that growers, applicators conduct a bee check, and that beekeepers in the area be notified if they want to be notified of a insecticide that's toxic to bees being used in the areas. And the existing regulations also require that this notification, this communication exists about 48 hours in advance to allow beekeepers the opportunity to do whatever they think they need to do for their beehives. So nothing changes with that. Protection of bees, the regulations concerning protection of bees is to facilitate communication, essentially. Are there any questions?
So Alex, that says when it's notification is still required if the intended application is to a blossoming plant. So if we're applying to grapes past bloom, we don't have to notify.
If you're applying to grapes past bloom, that's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. Okay, I know there is talk around the state about if there are flowers and weeds in the vineyard. This is language I've taken directly from the regulation. I don't know how that thought that an application hitting a plant in the vineyard, bee notification would be made, but the regulation does have that intended in, which would need to be proven for us to enforce. So kind of slippery language in the regulation. I get that, but yeah, doesn't apply. The Neonics don't apply to the existing bee regulations right now. Yes.
Oh, is it the applicator who is responsible to notify the beekeeper?
Yeah. So the question is the applicator responsible to notify the beekeeper? Yes, whoever is making that application is responsible for conducting the bee check. So if you're a pest control business, let me get back to you on that, because I don't know how it says in the language, but typically the flow of information goes from the grower to the beekeeper. If you're a pest control business, let me get back to you on that. I don't want to mislead anyone here in the room. Any other questions on neonics and bees? Yes, in the back.
So if you're using the same method of application, the same product more than once,
yes,
you're not restricted.
So the question is, if you're using the same product and the same method of application more than once in the year, in the growing season, you're not restricted. Not necessarily. There always will be restrictions if you're using a neonicotinoid on an agricultural commodity, but because if you are growing grapes, your only two restrictions are based on the blossoming period of the plant, that point one, the first point, and that second point, which wouldn't apply to you because you're only using one AI or one method. So there will always be a type of restriction, but it depends on the what you're growing and what you're growing and when you want to put it on. So yeah, neonics are restricted. That's kind of the message here. They're not restricted in the sense that they're a restricted material, but there is a restriction in regulation to how one can go along using it. There's another question back here. Yes.
So, okay, so drip application, so one application method, same chemistry, same product. Are you still limited to the 0.3 pounds of active ingredient, or can you go? Some of those labels will go above that.
Right. If you're using one active ingredient and one application method through the growing season, your limitation is going to be the label, whatever the label rate allows you to do.
National
If it goes above the 0.3.
Exactly, because if you look at the second point, you have to bring in a situation where you're mixing and matching active ingredients or application methods, right? If you are maxing it out, you may limit yourself in the future if you do want to bring in a second active ingredient or a second application method. Because if you're maxing out something at 0.7 pounds an acre for a drip, right? You've already gone past that cap of 0.3. 0.3 pounds an acre total of combined. So you can't add on anything after that fact to bring you back down to that 0.3 AI an acre. So I think my time is just about up. I know there's going to be a lot of specific, very scenario specific questions. I put my email address up there if you guys want to reach out and ask me anything about that. I do want to end off with some good news. So all these regulations have public comment periods, right? Where you and your industry groups have an opportunity to provide your insight and mold these regulations in the direction they take. You are heard, right? Industry groups are heard. The good news I want to give to you is that I know about a year ago there was talk of the decontamination facilities, decontamination equipment regulations coming online soon. Well, DPR has since pulled back and canceled any proposed regulation for that in response to the feedback they have gotten from every one of you. So you guys are heard. Your input is very important. Okay. Yeah. Thanks. With that, really, thanks for having me here today. I really appreciate seeing all you familiar faces. Okay.
Perfect.
Yes.
That's great.
Thank you. Thank you.